Story: Nightmare in My Apartment. The first November snow fell from the sky in cold patterns, and Edward felt a chill. His jaw throbbed from 3 missed blows. The guy from the football box hit hard and surely. Blood from his nose flooded his lips and chin, and it just wouldn't stop. Edward tightened his dirty scarf, lifted the collar of his grimy coat, and quickened his pace. "Did you get it, Edward?" asked Uncle Alex, a neighbor from downstairs, smoking near the entrance. He was hanging out by the box again. Edward didn't answer and silently ran into the open door. On the first floor by the elevator stood the annoying old woman Laura from the 9th floor, holding 2 bags. "Hey, Edward," she sneered. "Are you the one who's been walking around in my head?" I'll tell your mother." Edward slowed down by the stairs and gave her a questioning look. She snorted and shook her head. "Why are you sneaking into the attic? Stomping around? Probably smoking up there?" "I wasn't sneaking anywhere, Baba Laura," Edward replied. "I don't have any friends." Without waiting for any more jabs, he turned and ran upstairs. At the 7th floor, his mother had already opened the door. "Oh," she folded her arms over her chest. "Who do you look like? My God, what a troublemaker you are. Go to the bathroom and tilt your head back." "No way." Edward waved her off. Taking off his shoes, he pulled off his scarf and coat, pinched his nose with his thin fingers, and turned into the bathroom. His mother hurried after him. "How can I leave you here alone?" she lamented. "They'll kill you." Edward washed his face without answering. His mother didn't stop. "Who did this to you? From the yard or your box thing? Or from school? I'll give them a good calling." "Please, Mom, don't," Edward whispered, drying his face with a towel. "I'll be home this weekend. I'm not going anywhere." "Oh, I'll keep an eye on you," she threatened with her finger and went off to get a bandage. Edward washed his hands and went to his room. He lay down on his sofa and took his phone out of his pocket. A shiny crack stretched diagonally across the screen from the top corner. This time he was lucky. It was just the protective glass that had cracked. His mother returned with 2 small white bundles and handed them to Edward. "Here, put these in your nostrils. Are you going to have dinner?" Edward lazily shook his head and turned towards the wall. His mother sighed heavily and patted him on the back. "All right, sleep well. I'll pack your breakfast and leave it on the table. There's enough soup for 2 days, and some potatoes in the fridge. I'll come by Monday morning. At least call me." "Edward, do you want me to give you a pill?" He didn't answer. His mind no longer processed words. The pain in his jaw faded. A heavy sensation spread through his body, and he quickly began to drift into sleep. He dreamed of his hated school, but for some reason, all the stairs were destroyed. Edward wandered through the hallways, feeling that someone was behind him, but whenever he stopped and turned around, the pursuer disappeared behind the nearest corner, and Edward could only catch a glimpse of a bald head and terrifying eyes. Suddenly, Edward was nudged by his mother. "Take a gift to Baba Laura, quick," she chattered. "I'm so behind schedule." Edward reluctantly got up. His legs still ached from yesterday's unfair beating. He put on slippers, stepped into the stairwell, and ascended 2 flights before realizing he had forgotten the jars. Just then, he heard the elevator door open on his floor. "Did you take it?" his mother loudly asked. "Yeah," Edward answered even louder. His mother screamed. Someone who had arrived by elevator laughed hoarsely, and the apartment door slammed shut, the echo ringing through the entire stairwell. Startled, Edward bent over. His stomach felt as though it had been sliced open. Unbearable pain surged from his navel to his neck. He wanted to rush to help, but couldn't even move a few steps. His mother kept screaming, and even the closed door couldn't muffle her dying screams. Edward clenched his teeth, fell onto his back, and suddenly found himself back in his room, on the sofa, lying still in cold sweat. He stared at the horrifying face staring at him from the ceiling. Sleep paralysis, the boy realized. They had talked about it recently in class. It's a silly and frightening state where the body wakes up but the mind is still asleep, and if you open your eyes at that moment. Edward held onto this thought like a lifeline. As long as the thought stayed in his head, there was no fear. "It's just a dream," he reassured himself. "A simple hallucination, no more." For a moment, the comforting thought slipped away, and the creature on the ceiling seemed to sense the sweet terror. Its face lowered slightly, and it opened a large dark mouth. From his terrifying eyes, Warm blood dripped directly onto Edward. Out of the darkness, thin, pale shoulders appeared. The guy counted 4, and he was sure that the creature's lower limbs were hidden from his view. Like a giant spider, the monster crawled sideways and disappeared out of sight of the startled Edward. A gust of wind filled his ears, and it became very hard to breathe. The guy gasped for air through his dry lips, trying to scream something, hoping that his mother would hear and come to help. An icy terror froze in his chest. The creature was very close, perhaps just a couple of centimeters from his pillow. It wasn't the wind, Edward realized, and shuddered. It was breathing. His vision went dark, and he jerked awake. The cotton wads fell from his nostrils, and blood stained his pillowcase. His head felt heavy as if made of iron. His jaw ached. Pain pulsed in his eyes, and the back of his neck felt stiff, twitching with a sharp spasm. Edward staggered to the kitchen, put the kettle on, took 2 painkillers, and stared out the window. The sight of the gray sky and the street shrouded in fog made him feel melancholic. He was all alone in the apartment. His mother had left early. In the morning, the guy poured himself a coffee with milk and returned to his room. He checked his phone. There was one unread voicemail from his friend Pasha. "Well, I asked Harry about you. Then I checked with Ron. It was Rika's brother who beat you. He'll be here this weekend because he's visiting his mom, and their train leaves Monday. Ron said you should stay home. Like this idiot will come looking for you. He was there yesterday. Can you believe it? He shoved Max into a bend when you were being separated. What a freak." "That's it." Edward grimaced. His plans for the weekend were now completely decided. He called his mother, but she was unavailable. He wasn't surprised. The signal in the village was always terrible. "Mom," he shouted in the empty apartment. It always felt better to confirm she wasn't home before grabbing his stash from the desk drawer. There, in a pin box, wrapped in a plastic bag, Edward kept his cigarettes. He had to smoke carefully, sitting on the balcony with the window half closed. As soon as he struck the lighter, his neighbor, Uncle Alex, started chatting from below. Unlike Kostya, he almost leaned out to the waist and smoked his dawn tobacco. Sometimes, during their conversation, he'd call his wife at work, reporting how his morning was going. "Tara, I just got up." "Wait," he muttered. "Don't yell." "Yeah, I had some crazy dreams too." A bald face. "That's what you'll ask, and then you won't hear a thing." "A face." "I'm telling you, I don't know." "What?" "Some spider was crawling on the ceiling, breathing in my ears." "What's up?" "Another magnetic storm." Got it." Edward froze. He didn't even want to smoke anymore. He put the cigarette behind his ear, closed the window, and went back to the warm room. During the day, he chatted with his friends in the group chat, telling them about the dream and the neighbor. In response, the guys shared their own experiences with sleep paralysis. One girl mentioned a similar case when something huge, red with big eyes, sat on the ceiling. During the conversation, Edward didn't notice how his fear began to fade. Even the eerie coincidence with his neighbor's story no longer seemed strange. When night fell, the guy heated some dinner and sat down by his laptop. At 11 o'clock, his classmate Alice messaged him, asking if he had watched the new horror video on YouTube. She always enjoyed discussing new stories with him. They had become friends at the start of the school year because of this. "No, Alice, I haven't seen it," he replied. "I usually fall asleep to those things. I do my homework. It's more interesting." Alice wrote and sent a cheerful emoji. "All right, Edward, we'll message tomorrow. Maybe go for a walk." He didn't reply and, annoyed, slapped his hand on the table. How inconvenient that fight had been. Edward turned off all the lights for atmosphere, wrapped himself in a blanket, put on his headphones, and started the first story. It was about a creepy form and a monster with a bag of human hair. Edward couldn't lie on his side. The earphone pressed into his pillow and hurt his ear. He didn't lie on his back either and instead started reading the comments. People joked about some demon whose eyes were looked into. Some subscribers praised the plot and asked if it was real. Edward grimaced, snorted, and replied, "You're writing nonsense. Monsters like that don't exist. It's all made up. And the main character is an idiot half the time." He leaned back on the pillow, closed his eyes, and began to listen. The narrator's voice became quieter, and the words drowned in the fog of drowsiness. Edward slowly fell asleep. He woke up unexpectedly. The headphones were already playing another horror story. Someone was whispering in a chilling voice, "Alex. Alex." Edward put his phone on the nightstand, flipped the wet pillow, and briefly opened his eyes. Part of the wall in the hallway was illuminated with a faint yellow spot. That happened when the bathroom light was on. The guy pulled the blanket over his shoulders and shouted, "Mom, close the door." The rest of the word got stuck in his dry throat. Edward curled his legs up. A cold terror stabbed in his stomach. He moved closer to the wall, pressed his back against it, pulled the blanket up to his nose, and froze, staring at the doorframe. He clearly remembered turning off the lights. There was no mistake. The faint blue digits on the electric desk clock showed 1:30 a.m. The apartment was silent. The neighbors were quiet. Through the half-open window, the smell of wet asphalt drifted in from the silent dark street. The draft brushed against his damp, bony hair, and goosebumps ran from his scalp to his shoulders. In the hallway, the switch clicked, and the spot of light disappeared. Darkness reclaimed everything, leaving no blurred outlines of objects, only the blue digits of the clock floating in the air. Suddenly, Edward heard footsteps. They were coming from the direction of the bathroom. A short tapping on the linoleum, like heels, rhythmic, each second like a tap. The sounds reached the room, muffled by the carpet, making them eerily soft. Edward couldn't see anything, lying frozen, his gaze fixed on the clock. For a moment, the digits disappeared as someone passed by them, and then the rhythmic tapping shifted to the foam-insulated wall. Unimaginable limbs brutally pierced the wallpaper and reached for the ceiling. Edward's eyes slowly made out the moving object. A black clump at the center, like a core, with thin appendages, like huge spider legs. Reaching the top, something turned with a sickening squelch, and Edward managed to see the horrifying face he had encountered during his sleep paralysis. Thoughts whirled in his head. The guy lay motionless, not even trembling, though he was tense to the limit. Was this a dream or not, he wondered. Sweat beaded on his forehead, salty droplets fell into his eyes and trickled down his nose with an itchy feeling. Or was it sleep paralysis? Edward thought, wishing it wasn't. His heart vibrated with real horror. The guy suddenly realized that if this was happening for real, then there had been no sleep paralysis, and the creature was real, and he had seen it the night before. The monster crawled past the chandelier, froze over the couch, and quietly made a strange, rasping moan. Edward didn't see the creature. He lay on his side, too scared to move. "God," he prayed, "please don't realize I'm awake." As soon as he thought this, the moan repeated. The monster, seemingly mocking him, made it clear that it knew. Edward was on the verge of tears. They welled up in the corners of his eyes, mixing with sweat and coating his lashes. Under the blanket, it became hotter, but the goosebumps didn't go away from his bony body. His breathing quickened, and his heart raced faster. A new wave of fear swept over him. He couldn't show it. The creature would know. It would hear him. His pulse pounded painfully under his jaw, spasms piercing his bruises. The ringing in his ears blended with the low, drawn-out wheezing, and Edward realized that the creature wasn't stopping. "Why isn't it jumping on me? Why is it waiting?" he thought. Something dripped onto the pillow, then more, onto the blanket, hair, and finally onto his bony cheek. Spreading into a tiny puddle by his temple, it flowed across his eyelids and soon reached his lips. Blood. The frightened guy realized and bit his tongue to avoid screaming. Time seemed to freeze on the clock. It felt like an hour had passed, but in reality, only 2 minutes had gone by. Kostia's neck had gone numb, tiny needles pierced his scalp, covering his head like a cap. The blue digits smeared in the darkness, and the monster's moan turned into a squeal. The guy couldn't hold on to any thought. They scattered as soon as he tried to focus. He stopped feeling his hands and feet, then suddenly, outside the window, someone's car was humming reassuringly. Edward scrolled through the news on his phone, trying to distract himself from the eerie thoughts. When the street felt quiet, he turned on some music at a low volume and closed his tired eyes. A dream came back to him, his mother's scream and the sharp pain in his stomach. His brain treacherously directed all his thoughts there, to the nightmarish entrance hall where something descended in the elevator and spoke in a familiar voice. Then, suddenly, a strange ringing sounded. Edward gasped and opened his eyes. The sound wasn't from the dream, it was real. Slowly, he reached for his phone, paused the music, and glanced at the slightly ajar window. Behind it hung a creature. The terror came crashing down from above, pinning the defenseless young man to the bed, pouring its thin, writhing tendrils into his soul and mercilessly grinding it, leaving no hope of salvation. In the reflection of the desk lamp, the pale Harry glowed dark orange. She bared her teeth, twitching her thin limbs, and never stopped staring at the terrified Edward with her ash-colored gaze. The window, he thought, nearly choking on his tears. Not the door, the window. Why didn't I close it? Why? The monster sensed the distress and shook, then, gasping, it lunged into the room. The lamp flew off the table and shattered, and the creature darted under the couch, hissing loudly. Edward felt as if something had snapped inside him. The weight lifted, and fury flared in his chest. He screamed, jumped to the floor, and stepped on a sticky, cold appendage, like a worm. All his courage drained away. Edward froze and rushed into the corridor. He yanked the key from the door, stepped through, and put it back in the lock, turning it. His heart pounded. He stood still, clenching his teeth with his mouth half open, staring at the protruding key. From the room, he heard familiar clicking, then the gross sounds of something crawling across the carpet, and finally, claws scraping the door. Edward slapped his thigh. His phone was in his shorts pocket. He always carried it with him. Then, a terrible realization ran down his spine. He had left his phone on the nightstand. Moreover, his coat with the apartment keys was still in the room, in the closet. Edward cursed the day he convinced his mother to disconnect the unnecessary landline. The thought burned through his mind. He rushed into the living room, then to the kitchen, checking to make sure everything was locked. He wedged the balcony door with the mop. Grabbing his mother's package of valerian from the table, he ran to the bathroom, locked the door, and, after swallowing 4 pills, sat there until morning, without closing his eyes. Edward waited for his mother to return. When he heard her voice, he came out of hiding, frantic, and tried to explain what had happened. His words tangled in hysteria. The woman was stunned, sat down at the kitchen table, covering her mouth with her palm, shaking her head. "I don't understand, darling. Maybe you drank something?" Her look became more severe. "Admit it." Edward howled in despair. "I swear, Uncle Alex saw it too. It was hanging over him. Grandma Tanya said she heard someone walking in the attic. But you said it could have been a dream." "I don't understand anymore." Edward wiped his tears. "My heart hurts. My head is spinning. I couldn't call or run because I forgot everything in the room." His mother hesitated, sat in thought for a moment, then took a kitchen knife from the drawer, and went into the room. "Don't go," Edward pleaded from the floor. "Calm down," his mother replied sternly. "Where was it? Under the couch? There's nothing here." "And the lamp?" Edward mumbled. "Quieter. It's lying around." His mother returned and put the knife away in the drawer. "Did you break it?" Edward didn't answer, but everything clicked in his mind. No more excuses or self-deception. Everything that happened was real. It wasn't a dream or paralysis, but a nightmare. He suddenly gasped, remembering. It was walking on the wall. "Mom, let me show you." He led his mother to the room. Behind the slightly open closet door, there were indeed dents, torn wallpaper, and compressed insulation. "You should have pulled back the curtains, Edward," his mother lamented. "In that half-darkness, you can't see anything." "Oh, what is this?" She traced the dents with 2 fingers. Edward, meanwhile, wondered why he hadn't noticed them before, why it had only come to him now, and something was wrong with the closet. Why was the door open? Unlike usual, it meant the creature had opened it, and had it not escaped through the window but stayed to wait? A crash sounded from the living room. His mother jumped and ran toward it. Edward barely managed to reach out to grab her hand and stop her. His legs felt frozen to the floor. His mother disappeared around the corner. Her footsteps reached the next room, stopped, and then her piercing scream echoed throughout the apartment. It was exactly like the one in his dream, harrowing, strained, filled with despair and excruciating pain. Neighbors banged on the pipes. Objects began falling in the hallway. The creature was tormenting the unfortunate woman, throwing her around, strangling her with its pale appendages, slamming her head against the floor and walls. Blood splattered everywhere, and her face was unrecognizable. Beneath the red-streaked hair, only a dark crimson pulp remained. Edward retched, stumbling backward, whimpering softly like a cornered puppy. The cold November air blasted against his back through the draft. The boy grabbed his trembling forearm and pinched himself hard. Painful, this couldn't be a dream. The creature grinned, watching the tortured young man. It had nowhere to rush. Edward, trembling with terror, climbed onto the windowsill. The wind roared in his ears. The monster twitched, its mouth turning into a dark circle, and from the endless darkness, within came a familiar howl. Edward looked down. At best, he might land on the branch of the old birch tree and shorten the fall to the ground. At worst, he'd strike his head on the metal fence of the flower bed and leave half his skull on the dry bushes. He turned toward the room and brushed his nose against the beast's decaying face. The monster stood right next to him. In its dark maw, Edward saw the mangled body of his mother. It lay beside the severed head of Uncle Alex. Edward took one last shaky breath, pushed off, and hurled himself out the open window. A blow landed on his jaw, then another, hard, sly. Something clicked in his nose. The first November snow fell like tiny white grains on his head. Edward shivered. Hits hard, he thought, pulling his scarf tighter. No one was outside by the entrance, but inside by the elevator stood old lady Laura. "You've been stomping on my ceiling. Why were you climbing into the attic?" "Huh?" Edward waved her off and dashed up the stairs. His mother met him at the door, and everything started over again. His dying brain, like a jammed tape recorder, replayed the same final memories over and over. With each repetition, more details faded. Only the fall and his dying thought remained constant. "I don't want this." Edward lay broken on the cold ground. No chance of survival. Snow fell on his blood-soaked face. Neighbors and passers-by shouted. Dogs barked, and the ambulance siren wailed in the distance. But Edward heard none of it. Over and over, he trudged home from the cursed football field, reliving the 2 worst nights of his short life. Each cycle grew shorter, the details sparser. The cycle of agonizing death sped up, and Edward's soul dissolved into eternity.